March 1943. A requisitioned hotel on the Rue de Rivoli, Paris, curtains drawn against the curfew darkness. Obersturmführer Klaus Weber sleeps in his second-floor room, secure in his authority over occupied France. His Walther P-38 rests on the nightstand, his uniform hangs pressed and ready for morning inspections. Outside, German sentries patrol the street with practiced efficiency. He never wakes. The figure standing over his bed moves with surgical precision, hands steady, breathing controlled. The instrument descends once. Silence. The synthetic seal breaks on rough fabric. The poison enters his bloodstream. By morning, Weber is dead. The attending physician records heart failure. The autopsy finds nothing suspicious. The weapon that killed him sits in a jacket pocket 3 streets away, indistinguishable from 1,000 other fountain pens carried by Parisian office workers. It had no barrel markings, no military finish, no obvious blade. It was, by conventional standards, the most harmless object a man could carry. It was also the most personal killing instrument ever issued to British agents. This was the SOE fountain pen dagger, and it turned stationery into a weapon of silent war. The problem facing British intelligence in 1940 was brutally simple. How do you kill a man when you cannot make a sound, cannot leave evidence, and cannot be within arm's reach when he dies? Winston Churchill's directive to the newly formed Special Operations Executive was unambiguous: set Europe ablaze. But sabotaging railways and blowing up factories required explosives and timing devices. Eliminating specific targets required something far more intimate. German officers, Gestapo informants, and collaborationist officials moved through occupied territories with bodyguards, stayed in guarded quarters, and maintained unpredictable schedules. Traditional assassination methods failed against such precautions. Conventional weapons were wholly inadequate for this environment. A pistol, even silenced, produced muzzle flash and required the agent to be present during death. A rifle demanded distance and escape routes. Poison required access to food or drink under constant observation. Explosives killed indiscriminately and announced British involvement to every German investigator within 100 kilometers. What SOE needed was something that existed in the space between weapon and ordinary object. Something an agent could carry through Gestapo checkpoints without triggering suspicion. Something that could be deployed in seconds. Required no specialized training beyond what SOE already provided, and left the victim appearing to have died from natural causes or unexplained collapse. The weapon needed to satisfy 3 seemingly contradictory requirements. First, it had to be completely innocuous when inspected by German security forces conducting random searches. Thousands of people carried fountain pens, pocket knives, and cigarette cases through occupied Europe daily. The weapon had to disappear into this landscape of ordinary objects. Second, it had to be immediately lethal when deployed. An agent operating alone behind enemy lines could not afford a struggle, could not risk a target crying out or reaching for help. Third, it had to require no follow-up. The agent had to be able to walk away knowing the target would die without intervention, without the weapon being discovered on the body, and without evidence pointing toward British involvement. These requirements represented a design challenge unlike anything British weapons manufacturers had faced. The Fairbairn, Sykes fighting knife, already issued to commandos, was elegant and deadly but unmistakably military. The Welrod pistol achieved near-silent kills but remained visibly a firearm. The cyanide pills, carried by some agents, were reliable but required the target to ingest them voluntarily, an impossibility in most operational scenarios. Many SOE agents died attempting assassinations with inadequate tools. In occupied France, an agent attempting to knife a Gestapo officer in Lyon in 1941 was overpowered and shot. His blade, though sharp, required too much force and too much time. In Denmark, another agent attempting to poison a collaborationist official was caught tampering with a wine bottle. The method was too slow, too observable, and too dependent on circumstances beyond the agent's control. The human cost of these failures was severe. Captured agents faced interrogation, torture, and execution. The resistance networks they had built were rolled up by German counterintelligence. Entire operations collapsed because a single assassination attempt failed. The bodies piled up not because agents lacked courage, but because they lacked the proper tools. The British needed something different. something that weaponized the mundane, something that turned an everyday object into an instrument of targeted elimination. The solution came from Station XII. The solution came from Station XII at Aston House near Stevenage, Hertfordshire. This unremarkable country estate, requisitioned in 1940, served as the Special Operations Executive's primary research and development facility for sabotage devices and covert weapons. The house had been relocated from its original purpose as a private residence to become what one SOE officer later called the most dangerous workshop in England. Its laboratories occupied former drawing rooms. Its testing grounds stretched across manicured lawns now cratered by experimental explosives. Its workshops hummed with lathes, presses, and chemical apparatus operated by scientists, engineers, and craftsmen sworn to absolute secrecy. Under Professor Dudley Maurice Newitt, a decorated Great War veteran and chemical engineer from Imperial College London, Station XII became the Empire's most prolific producer of irregular warfare equipment. During the war years, it produced thousands of specialized detonators, hundreds of disguised explosive devices, and dozens of assassination weapons designed for situations where conventional arms proved useless. But among its most ingenious products were the concealed killing instruments intended for close quarters elimination. The strategic problem SOE faced in early 1941 was one of asymmetric vulnerability. German occupation forces controlled Europe through a hierarchical system of military governors, Gestapo officers, and collaborationist administrators. These men maintained order through terror, oversaw deportations, coordinated anti-resistance operations, and ensured industrial production flowed toward the German war machine. They were individually the keystone targets whose removal could disrupt entire occupation structures. Yet these same men were extraordinarily difficult to approach. They moved with security details, lived in commandeered hotels and requisitioned estates, and maintained irregular schedules deliberately designed to frustrate assassination attempts. The Gestapo had become expert at identifying agents, penetrating resistance cells, and anticipating SOE tactics. By mid-1941, the life expectancy of an SOE agent operating in occupied France measured in weeks, not months. When an agent did manage to get close enough to eliminate a target, the available methods were catastrophically inadequate. A knife attack required physical strength, time for the blade to do its work, and acceptance of blood evidence that would immediately identify the death as murder. A garrote needed sustained pressure, risked the victim crying out, and demanded the agent remain present throughout the killing. A pistol, even with the newly developed well-rod suppressor, remained recognizably a firearm if discovered during the inevitable German investigation. The Gestapo checkpoint system compounded these problems. Random searches could happen anywhere at any time. An agent carrying a Fairbairn, Sykes' dagger had no plausible explanation if discovered. An agent carrying a well-rod pistol faced immediate execution. An agent carrying poison vials raised obvious questions about intent. Real examples demonstrated the fatal inadequacy of existing methods. In early 1942, an SOE agent in occupied Belgium attempted to eliminate a Gestapo interrogator known for torturing captured resistance members. The agent managed to get within striking distance using forged credentials, but carried only a standard pocket knife. The resulting struggle lasted nearly 30 seconds, long enough for guards to respond. The agent was captured, the target survived, and the entire Brussels resistance network was compromised within a week. What Station XII needed to develop was a weapon satisfying brutally specific requirements. It had to measure no more than 6 inches in total length, small enough to fit in a jacket pocket without creating a suspicious bulge. It had to weigh less than 3 ounces, light enough to carry constantly without fatigue. It had to appear completely harmless when inspected, something a German security officer would glance at and immediately dismiss as ordinary stationery or a personal grooming item. But the moment an agent needed it, the weapon had to transform. The killing mechanism had to deploy in under 2 seconds. The strike had to be decisive enough that a single application would guarantee death, either immediately or within hours. The method had to leave minimal evidence, ideally appearing as heart failure, stroke, or unexplained collapse rather than obvious murder. Most critically, the weapon had to function as both assassination tool and psychological instrument. German officers needed to understand, however slowly, that their security measures meant nothing. That an agent could approach them, could touch them, could kill them with something as innocuous as the pen they themselves carried for signing deportation orders. The British needed a weapon that weaponized normalcy itself. The solution emerged from Station XI's specialized weapons section in late 1941. The lead designers remain partially obscured by wartime secrecy, though records confirm Professor Newitt oversaw the project and a small team of precision engineers and chemists developed the working prototypes. They approached the problem not as weapons designers, but as specialists in deception, asking a fundamental question: what object could a man carry anywhere, examine closely, and never suspect of lethality? The answer was stationery, specifically fountain pens. The technical challenge broke down into three distinct engineering problems. First, the concealment problem required creating a functional pen that could withstand casual inspection while housing a killing mechanism. Second, the lethality problem demanded a blade or poison delivery system effective enough to guarantee death from a single application. Third, the deployment problem required a mechanism simple enough to operate under stress, in darkness, without practice or rehearsal. To achieve all three simultaneously required innovations that pushed British precision manufacturing to its limits. The concealment problem began with pen selection. Station XII chose fountain pen bodies as the base platform because they offered the ideal combination of innocuousness and internal volume. A fountain pen measured approximately 6 inches in length, with the cap accounting for 2 inches and the barrel 4 inches. The barrel's hollow interior, normally containing the ink reservoir and feed mechanism, provided exactly enough space for a concealed blade. The solution involved manufacturing completely functional fountain pens that wrote normally, filled with ink through standard mechanisms, and could survive examination by suspicious Gestapo officers. The nib had to write smoothly enough that an agent could demonstrate the pen's functionality if challenged. The clip had to attach firmly enough to withstand daily carry. The finish had to match civilian pens of the period, with maker's marks from recognizable manufacturers like Schiefer or Waterman applied to the barrel. Only when the cap was unscrewed and fully removed did the weapon reveal itself. Beneath the visible nib assembly, concealed within the pen body, sat a blade measuring approximately 3 inches in length. The blade was fashioned from surgical steel, ground to a needlepoint, with beveled edges tapering to microscopic sharpness. Unlike traditional knife blades designed for cutting, this blade was optimized for piercing, with a cross-section shaped to penetrate clothing, skin, and muscle with minimal resistance. The lethality problem required solving both mechanical and chemical challenges. The blade alone, though capable of inflicting fatal wounds, if properly placed, could not guarantee immediate death. An agent stabbing a target in the torso might strike bone, miss vital organs, or deliver a wound the target could survive long enough to raise an alarm. What Station XII needed was absolute certainty of death. The solution was poison. The blade's tip was sealed with a synthetic compound containing concentrated toxins. Historical records suggest the poison was likely a rapid, acting nerve agent or cardiac toxin, though the specific formula remains classified even today. The seal was designed to break upon contact with rough fabric or skin, releasing the poison directly into the wound channel created by the blade. The effect was devastating. A target struck with the poisoned blade would experience rapid cardiovascular collapse or neurological shutdown. Death would occur within minutes to hours depending on the strike location and poison concentration. Critically, the symptoms would mimic heart failure or stroke, common enough in the stressed environment of wartime occupation that German physicians would rarely suspect foul play. Station XII produced multiple variants to suit different operational requirements. The standard model featured only the concealed blade and poison. The deluxe variant, produced in extremely limited numbers, incorporated an additional killing mechanism, a garrote wire concealed between the pen body and cap. This braided steel wire, approximately 8 inches in length when fully extended, could be looped around a target's neck for silent strangulation if blade deployment proved impossible. The deployment problem was solved through elegant simplicity. An agent removed the pen cap as if preparing to write, exposing the nib assembly. With a firm twist, the nib section unscrewed from the barrel, revealing the blade beneath. The entire deployment sequence required approximately 3 seconds from pocket to ready position. No special training was needed beyond what SOE agents already received in close quarters combat techniques. Production methods evolved through several phases as Station XII refined the manufacturing process. The initial prototypes were handcrafted by skilled instrument makers, each pen requiring approximately 40 hours of precision work. Later production runs employed semi-automated techniques borrowed from the watch-making industry, reducing manufacturing time to roughly 15 hours per unit. The final production variant measured exactly 6 inches in total length. Weight came to approximately 2.8 ounces when empty, rising to 3.1 ounces when filled with ink. The blade extended 2.5 inches from the pen body when deployed. Effective range was touch distance only. Optimal use scenarios involved approaching the target from behind or during close conversation, striking rapidly to the neck, chest, or abdomen, then withdrawing before the target understood what had occurred. The weapon's physical appearance was deliberately unremarkable. The black resin barrel showed no military markings. The gold-colored clip and capband matched civilian pen aesthetics of the 1940s. The nib, when examined, appeared entirely functional. An agent could carry this pen through a dozen Gestapo checkpoints, write reports with it, leave it visible on a desk, and never raise the slightest suspicion. That ordinariness was the weapon's deadliest feature. Production began in late 1941 at Station XII's specialized workshop facilities. The exact numbers remain disputed in historical records, a common occurrence with SOE's most sensitive weapons systems. Estimates suggest between 10 and 30 complete pen dagger sets were manufactured during the war years, with the most reliable sources citing a figure of 10 units, specifically produced for the Bureau Central de Renseignements et d'Action, the intelligence service of the Free French forces operating alongside SOE. The uncertainty exists not because records were destroyed, but because Station XII maintained deliberately vague production logs for assassination weapons. Unlike the thousands of explosive devices and sabotage tools that required mass production, close quarters killing instruments were custom, manufactured in tiny batches for specific operations or high-value agents. Each pen was hand-finished, tested for functionality, and issued with strict accountability measures that left minimal paper trails. Distribution relied on SOE's established infiltration networks. The Special Duties Squadrons, flying modified Halifax, Sterling, and Lysander aircraft, conducted hundreds of clandestine insertion flights across occupied Europe throughout 1942 and 1943. Agents parachuted into France, Belgium, Denmark, and Norway carried these concealed weapons among their standard equipment packages, which typically included wireless sets, currency, forged documents, and cyanide capsules for use if captured. By war's end, pen daggers had been distributed to resistance networks across multiple theaters, though precise geographic allocation remains unclear from surviving documentation. In France, SOE agents and Free French operatives of the BCRA used concealed blade weapons extensively throughout the occupation. Their targets included Gestapo officers conducting interrogations, collaborationist police officials, and German administrative personnel overseeing deportations. The pen's innocuous appearance made it ideal for penetrating the security cordons surrounding high-value targets in urban environments where resistance fighters had limited access to firearms. One account from post-war debriefings describes an operation in occupied Paris during spring 1943. An agent using forged credentials as a municipal clerk gained access to a German administrative office. The target, a mid-ranking official responsible for coordinating forced labor deportations, received the agent for what appeared to be a routine document review. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. The official was found dead at his desk 2 hours later. The attending German physician recorded heart failure as the cause of death. No weapon was discovered. The investigation concluded within 3 days without identifying suspects. In Denmark, resistance cells received limited quantities of British covert weapons beginning in 1942. Danish operatives used these tools for eliminating Gestapo informants and collaborators whose removal would disrupt German counterintelligence operations without triggering the mass reprisals that followed more dramatic assassinations like the killing of Reinhard Heydrich in Prague. SOE liaison officers working with the Norwegian resistance employed concealed weapons during operations targeting German officers in isolated garrison towns where firearms would immediately alert nearby troops. The psychological impact on German occupation forces proved difficult to quantify, but significant nonetheless. Officers who survived the war years in occupied territories later described a pervasive anxiety about physical security. The realization that resistance operatives could approach, could touch, could kill using everyday objects created an atmosphere of constant vigilance that drained resources and undermined morale. German security services responded by increasing random searches, expanding restricted zones around key personnel, and implementing more rigorous vetting of civilian workers with access to occupation administration buildings. These countermeasures diverted manpower from frontline duties and created friction between German authorities and civilian populations subjected to ever more intrusive security protocols. If you're finding this deep dive into SOE's covert assassination tools interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It helps the channel and means you won't miss the next one. Here is where the story becomes complicated. Despite the pen daggers produced and distributed across occupied Europe, documented records of specific pen weapon attacks remain remarkably sparse. No named operations with confirmed dates and locations appear in declassified SOE files. No post-war testimony explicitly describes killing a German officer with a fountain pen dagger. This absence requires explanation. The weapon was designed to leave no evidence. A successful attack would appear to German investigators as heart failure, stroke, or unexplained death, not assassination. A body searched after death would reveal no weapon, no obvious wounds beyond what might be dismissed as insect bites or minor abrasions, and no clear indicators of British involvement. That deniability was the entire point. If pen daggers worked as intended, successful attacks would be historically invisible, recorded in German death registers as natural causes rather than resistance operations. The weapon's true effectiveness may be measured not in confirmed kills, but in the climate of fear it helped create among occupation forces who understood, perhaps only intuitively, that their security was an illusion. The broader SOE campaign of targeted elimination achieved devastating psychological results through combined methods. Between 1941 and 1944, resistance forces across occupied Europe conducted hundreds of assassination operations against German personnel and collaborators, creating an atmosphere of vulnerability that no amount of security could dispel. In France alone, resistance attacks killed an estimated 2,000 German soldiers and officials during the 18 months preceding D-Day. These operations forced German commanders to divert substantial manpower to rear area security duties. One German general later described the situation as requiring constant vigilance against an enemy who wears no uniform and strikes without warning, tying down forces desperately needed on the eastern and western fronts. Whether pen daggers contributed significantly to these numbers matters less than whether they contributed to the climate of uncertainty that characterized German occupation. The knowledge that resistance operatives possessed weapons indistinguishable from everyday objects created a paranoia that undermined German authority and morale throughout occupied territories. The concept's influence extended beyond 1945. Cold War intelligence agencies studied SOE's concealed weapon designs when developing their own covert assassination tools. CIA Technical Services documentation from the 1950s references British wartime innovations in disguised weapons as foundational to American developments in the same field. The weapon pioneered what became standard doctrine for intelligence services operating in denied areas. Assassination tools must be invisible until the moment of use, must leave minimal forensic evidence, and must provide plausible deniability for the sponsoring government. Modern close quarters elimination techniques, though employing different technologies, trace their conceptual lineage directly to Station XII's innovations in weaponizing ordinary objects. Examples of SOE pen weapons survive today in military museums and private collections. The Imperial War Museum holds several SOE concealed weapons in its collection, though pen daggers remain among the rarest items due to limited production numbers. When specimens appear at auction, They command prices exceeding 4,000, reflecting both their historical significance and extreme scarcity. March 1943. A requisitioned hotel on the Rue de Rivoli, darkness settling over occupied Paris. British engineers created a weapon so effective that its successes remain invisible in historical records, so dangerous that Germany implemented sweeping security changes despite having no confirmed intelligence about its existence, so ordinary in appearance that it could pass through Gestapo checkpoints without triggering the slightest suspicion. 10 units manufactured, distributed to resistance networks across France, Denmark, Norway, and Belgium. An unknown number of targets eliminated with deaths recorded as natural causes rather than assassination. The SOE fountain pen dagger represents covert warfare at its most sophisticated. A weapon measured not in confirmed kills, but in psychological impact, operational deniability, and the transformation of everyday objects into instruments of silent elimination. British engineers solved a problem others had not even properly identified. They turned Germany's occupation infrastructure into a vulnerability by making every interaction with civilian personnel a potential security threat. And they did it with a fountain pen that wrote perfectly functional letters when needed but concealed death beneath its nib. That was British ingenuity. That was Station XII. And that was how a harmless pen helped destroy the Third Reich from the inside.